about, okay, now here are the things to look for, where you know it's about to be destroyed. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So what Jesus says is, when you see this abomination of desolations, something that was prophesied about in Daniel, Daniel chapter 9, chapter 11, chapter 12 have reference to this. And if you go and read the prophecies of Daniel, we won't take the time to do that tonight, but it's apparent that the abomination of desolation is a foreign army that invades Jerusalem and overwhelms the temple. Without saying much more about that, that's indicated in the prophecies in Daniel. So he says, when you see that about to happen, get out of Dodge. That's the time to leave. Flee, because then the destruction is near. He goes on and explains to them that they need to go quickly to a place of safety, and that there's going to be difficulty in travel at that time. He gives them all sorts of warnings and heads up, really, about what's going to happen. He says in verse 15, let him who is on the housetop not go down into the house, nor enter or take anything out of the house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter. So it would be a difficult flight to escape the invading armies and to get out of Jerusalem before it was surrounded and besieged and the temple was destroyed. It's interesting that history tells us that many Jews were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Josephus says it was over 1 million Jews that either died of starvation or slaughter from the Romans. But we have no record, I don't know of any at least, of any Christians being put to death in Jerusalem at that time, because they heeded the warning of Jesus. It pays to pay attention to Jesus. These warnings were given to people who believed Jesus' words, and they believed Jesus' words and they saw this coming, and they got out of town in time. Jesus says that the tribulation is going to be the worst that's ever seen. In verse 19, in those days there will be tribulation such as not been since the beginning of the creation, which God created until this time, nor shall ever be. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. As I said, Josephus said over 1 million Jews were killed during the siege of Jerusalem. And he also wrote about it, and I'll just quote this historian who lived to see it, was an eyewitness, I believe, of the event. He said, no other city ever suffered miseries, nor did any age from the beginning of the world ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was. And he also says, if the miseries of all mankind from the creation were compared, those which the Jews then suffered, they would appear inferior. So it was also Josephus' estimation, who saw the destruction of Jerusalem, that it was the worst thing that ever happened to anybody in the history of the world. It's an interesting assessment, and it does seem to fulfill, does it not, the very prophecy, the very words of Jesus about the destruction of Jerusalem. Again, Jesus warns about false Christs and false prophets. He says, they'll rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed, see, I've told you these things beforehand. So Jesus is giving his followers a heads up about what's going to happen, about what to prepare for. And if you think about it, the fact that they could get out of Jerusalem and escape all of this really helped the cause of Christianity to continue on and flourish through the end of the first century and on through the ages as it has. Disciples can be prepared because Jesus told them beforehand. That's the point. But then go on and look at his description, Jesus' description of his coming in judgment against Jerusalem. He says, in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon shall not give its light. The stars of heaven will fall and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. If you're not used to prophetic language, and maybe haven't studied the Old Testament prophets, it may seem to you that Jesus is talking here about literally the sun and moon getting dark and problems in the cosmos, so to speak, and with celestial bodies. But in reality, those are symbols. The sun, moon, and stars are symbols of ruling powers. If you think about it, way back in the book of Genesis, the sun was created by God to rule the day, the Bible says, and the moon and stars were to rule the night. And so they become, in prophetic language, symbols of nations and rulers. And the idea is that there's going to be this huge shakeup among the nations when Jerusalem falls. And certainly Israel would no longer be a power. It would no longer be shining at all as a powerful light. This same language is used, as I said, in the prophecies of the Old Testament. Also, it's used in the book of Revelation to similar effect. Back in Isaiah, I'll just give you one example of this. In Isaiah 13, there's a prophecy about the fall of Babylon that was seen by Isaiah 13. Chapter 13 and verse 1 says. Chapter 13 and verse 9, Isaiah describes it this way. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. Now this is plainly, again, a prophecy, it's stated, a prophecy about the destruction of Babylon, which was a foreign power that had conquered Jerusalem about 600 BC. But the point is, this same language is used by the prophets at other times when there were great upheavals in world governments and shifting in power among the nations. What would happen when these events occurred is that Jesus' power and glory would be clearly seen by those who understood certainly that it was his power that was accomplishing these things. He says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. He will send his angels and gather together his elect to the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. This language may seem like it's talking about the end of time, but really, I believe it's talking about just the gathering together of God's truly chosen people, no longer the Jews, but Christians who would be gathered by him, protected, kept safe, in contrast to Israel, whom the Lord judged at the destruction of Jerusalem. The idea of the Lord coming in judgment is, again, prophetic language used frequently in the Old Testament to describe the destruction of a city or the destruction of a nation, when God would come upon people in temporal judgment, and then his power and glory would have to be acknowledged as a consequence of that. And I believe that same sort of thing is being prophesied here concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. So we go on, and this is a painting, a famous painting done by Hayez of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It's probably not very accurate, but it does sort of give you a feel for the tragedy of it all. This is a picture taken by Farrell Jenkins of some stones that were uncovered in 1967 in some work that was being done around the temple precinct. These stones appear to have come from the first century and had to have been cast down from above, so to speak. And it's widely believed that they're the broken stones, one not laying, set on top of another any longer. And they're the size and at the place where you'd expect those stones to be. So it's interesting, impressive archaeological information that we get seeing those stones. In fact, that this prophecy of Jesus did come true in great detail, demonstrates him to be exactly who he said he was, the Son of God and the Christ of God, the one to become King of God's people. So we continue on in Mark chapter 13, then we come to verse 28. And Jesus says, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near, at the doors. You can look at a tree and it's beginning to bud, and it must be warming up. Summer is coming on. That's what Jesus is saying here. He says, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. This is a critical turning point in Mark chapter 13, It's a critical turning point in Jesus' discussion. Here he's saying, everything that I've said so far is going to happen in this generation. That's one reason we know that the previous statements were not talking about the end of time. Obviously, time didn't end in that generation. So